Hello, everyone. I'm Frances Widdowson. Welcome to the Rational Space Disputations. And for people who haven't seen the episodes before, the format of the disputations is for me to invite a guest on the program who I admire or who I find their work is interesting. And we are going to have 1 hour of me asking the guest questions. And then the second hour is going to be the guest asking me questions. And the idea is to, see where the points of disagreement lie, if there are any points of disagreement, and perhaps to bring up sort of questions which might challenge the perspective of the guest or of me, because it has to be understood at this point in time that not everyone shares every single opinion, and it's not a problem to try to investigate points of disagreement, which I think is a major problem which exists today, where people feel that they have to be silent if they don't agree with someone. So that's the plan for this series of episodes. So for today, my guest is Albert Howard. Welcome, Albert.
Oh, this is where I say thank you for having me.
And Albert.
That's all I know about interviews.
And Albert is someone, I guess I can say this. There's no one who I admire more than Albert. And I'm being truthful about that because I think that Albert, and although Albert, of course, and I have written many things together, still, I think Albert is the most principled person that I know, and Albert is a vigilant, critical analyst of all things to some extent. So I think he's a great person to have on. And it might surprise people to know, but Albert and I do disagree on a number of things. So I'm hoping to explore some of these points of disagreement as well as our points of agreement. So before we start, Albert, perhaps you can just explain to our audience a little bit about yourself, perhaps your interests, what you're working on, those kinds of things, so they can get a bit of a sense of who you are and where you're coming from.
Well, I'm a person who has never had any ambition, which should be a starting point. So I've kind of always allowed things to happen to me and just dealt with them as they come. I spent a lot of time in the advertising business, which I kind of sidled into originally as writing little bits of copy for McLean Hunter. And then I got a job at McLean Hunter, and then sidled into the advertising business and spent a lot of time there. While I was there, I discovered a particular interest in teaching and instructing other people. And that incorporated itself into advertising as well. And as soon as I had the opportunity to do it even more specifically, I jumped to that. I've been a socialist for a long time, and with specific orientation toward Trotskyism. Trotskyism can be defined as being an internationalist concept of socialism compared to the nationalist concept that Stalin had. Yeah, I'm interested in everything human and political and like that.
So I guess we can start there then, with respect to socialism. So in your view, how do you see socialism? What is your, because there's many different kinds of socialism. What is your kind of socialism?
Well, let's just get to the core, the simple thing that every socialist agrees to, and that is the social ownership of the means of production and the social distribution of the value produced by that. So now we can see all kinds of different ways that this may be effective. But we haven't seen socialism anywhere yet. So we can't really say what it actually is, except for the fact that it is what I just described, the distribution, the collective ownership by society of the means of production and the resulting distribution of the product among everybody on an equal basis. Now, the result of that, because could be a number of different things. I know that Marx speculated on what the future would be like, but I wouldn't dare go there.
Yes, that is something that is obviously very difficult, because we're dealing with very complicated reality. And so to make predictions is difficult. However, I believe it is possible to identify some of the sources, some of the problems which exist. And many of these problems, would you argue, are due to capitalism? Is that to some extent what we're dealing with here? Is that,
Can you ask me that again?
Yeah. So, like, although we can't predict the future, that's a fool's errand. We can identify some of the problems which exist.
The problems with socialism, or
no, the problems with capital. Like, one of the problems I think socialists would argue is that there's problems that are inherent within the capitalist, what would be considered to be the capitalist mode of production.
Well, the first thing we have to consider about capitalism is it creates classes in society. And if you have classes, you have conflict. So this is a massive thing for us to overcome. And conflicts, almost all the conflicts that we see in society and the differences are related to class society and the interests of what Marx called the two great classes, the working class and the capitalist class. And of course, there is a class between that of people who are part of both, or accelerators of capitalism, and that is the middle class, or what Marx called the petit bourgeois.
Yes. And so this conflict, this conflict between classes is a major problem. Why is that seen as, or why would you see that as such a problem, for that to be in existence?
Well, it's so inherently conflicting.
Mm-hmm.
The struggle of humanity to develop and to advance is a struggle to overcome conflict. Conflict is such a waste. It takes away developmental and progressive forces, and forces them into defending and against the attack of generally of conservative forces, which are trying to resist progress and maintain capitalism and so on. But we have a situation we have to recognize that as long as capitalism exists, we have the oppression of the people who produce the value in society, labor.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this constant there's this battle with something that is essential. Without labor, we can't have anything.
Yes. And I believe that one of the fundamental tenets of at least the historical materialism kind of variant of socialism is what's called the labor theory of value. It's accepted, the labor theory of value. Now, I spent some time trying to understand the labor theory of value. I don't have a particularly sophisticated understanding of it. And that's one of the things I was hoping that we could get into a little bit to help viewers understand this a bit more, and to some extent to help me understand it a little bit more. I've looked at things, but I get a little bit confused when I'm trying to think it through. And I've always found that your perspective is quite clear. on it when I've heard you talk about it. And I was wondering if you could just perhaps outline what you see the labor theory values being and why you think it's valid. It's a valid theory.
Yeah, well, I would like to have it to understand it more clearly as well. I think that the best way to look at the labor theory of value, which is supported and accepted but with many different versions by various economists, from Marx to Smith and Ricardo and a number of others. The basic idea of the labor theory of value is that everything prior to the application of labor is dormant. So just take an example. Let's say we have a unit of production like a factory of some sort. And the purpose of this is to produce commodities, to produce goods. Now we have all of first of all, we have to have the unit itself, which is the factory, bricks and mortar. And this has to be paid for, this has to be maintained, this has to have all of the things. These are called, in economics, they're called inputs. So we've got the factory, and now we've got the taxation, the heat, everything else. And then we're going to make something. So it's going to be, if it's going to be made of whatever the raw materials are, let's say they're wood, or if it's a furniture factory, or metal sheets, or some or if it's an assembly kind of factory where you get all the pre-made elements and you assemble them the way the automotive industry does. The automotive industry doesn't make anything. It assembles the products that it gets from a previous supplier in the supply chain. However, all of these things would sit there, fenders and headlights and all of the pieces of a car, and they come in, and these would be inputs. They would be all placed there and all sitting there in the factory with heat on and the lights on and everything else, and nothing will happen until you put one more input in there, and that is labor. The labor is a transitional force, goes from the dormancy to the value. So these people produce, now we have value. We have a whole bunch of inputs, and now we have a car. And without labor, there would be absolutely no car. There would just be a bunch of things that would list there indefinitely. And this is true of all, you can apply that to all forms of production. So one of the resistance to that is that people will say, who don't like to think about it too much, but or like to think about their own view, is that, what about the ideas? Aren't they valuable? Well, I just ask you, put a bunch of ideas together and see how much money that makes. Because unless those ideas are transformed into labor, they are just ideas. And we have everybody, let's call ideas notions because of their originality. If you have, we all have lots of notions every day, hundreds that just pass by. Good idea here, good idea there, and nothing happens. And because those things don't happen, but sometimes some of them do. One of them picks up and it goes to the next stage. It just dies as an idea, or we do something about it. We manufacture that. This applies to art as well. The notion of the art, then the execution of it, and then the final third that makes it what it is public acknowledgement of it. Because without the third, it's just not doing anything anyway. So we have a situation where of all of these views, suddenly an idea comes into fruition, and somebody thinks it's a good idea, and what do? They apply labor to it, and it becomes a reality. And if you don't think labor is the big thing, just look at what happens when you have a strike. All of these other things and all the ideas and all of the people who had it, who had these ideas and initiated it and everything else, are doing nothing now because the workers have stopped applying labor.
Yes. Yes.
That's a distinction we have to look at all the time. For all the people who say it's the ideas, ideas pay you nothing. Let's say hypothetically, I have an idea for an engine that can run on water. Wouldn't that be a great idea? That's a great idea, right? That I don't see anybody giving me any money. Should there be a flow of dollars falling on me because I had that idea?
Yes.
No, but if I made the engine and if workers were applied, if labor was applied to that idea, then it
Yeah.
would have value.
Yes.
So that's
Uh,
the fundamental, raw, simplistic idea of the value of labor.
and it seems to me a little bit that it's the thing. If you go back in time, go back in the process, it's the thing that has concreteness to it. That's almost how it seems to me, is that everything else seems to be an abstraction when we're bringing in matters. And there's just a couple, and I was just trying to think of some of the objections to the labor theory of value that I've heard of, that the ideas is one of them. But I was just reading this morning, actually, to kind of try and get my head around it, but I just got a little bit more, I got slightly more confused when I was reading this account by Bertrand Russell, actually, because Bertrand Russell is one of the major thinkers who I am very interested in, and I read a great deal of what he has to argue about philosophy. But in well, he has this is the basic writings of Bertrand Russell, and he has actually an article on why I am not a communist. That's one of which I thought was quite interesting. I didn't think it was particularly fair, that one, but then he gets into the economic aspects of it, and he takes exception to the labor theory of value because he argues that it doesn't consider other elements of the system enough, which are, and I'll just list them for you, managers, the role that managers play within the system, the cost of raw materials. So for example, oil, which is a very, very expensive raw material, versus sand or something like that, where there's almost an unlimited supply of it. And then land. And he seems to be saying towards the end of the article, and I have to go back over it in detail, that it's kind of monopoly. That's the problem, not profit. Like he thinks that it's a problem when there's a monopolization of things, not the actual nature of the. So it's monopolies that enter into the capitalist system, not the capitalist system itself, that Russell sees as being the problem. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on those. And that's, I'm probably not doing justice to his criticism of it, but I thought it was an interesting starting point, because it has occurred to me before that very, very expensive raw materials, things which are highly prized within the production process, I don't quite know how that's reconciled with labor and value and so on.
Well, what are the raw materials have to be processed in order to be
Yes.
used. So when we have, you know, my example of one factory here is these people don't mine. They don't cut down the trees to make the lumber. There's a succession of in the supply chain that ends up with tables and chairs, but starts off in the forest. So you have all of these things, and each of these produce value. A tree has no value at all until somebody cuts it down and turns it into lumber.
Mm.
That's the application of labor. But now you have to sell that lumber to the next stage, which is people who warehouse it and categorize it and put it into and shape it into workable things. And then it goes to the next stage. And finally, it ends up specifically in certain forms, all applied through labor, to a furniture manufacturer.
Mm.
And they shape it and put it all together and then turn out and then sell it to the end user. What Russell is not doing is making a distinction between value and price.
Mm.
And that's is the problem
I think
there.
he sees them as the same.
Pardon?
I think he sees them as the same was the
I
impression.
realize that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so why is, like, that's a very difficult thing for me.
Well,
How are they different? I don't
they're
quite.
different because the value is the result of what of labor, and the price is the arbitrary choice of the seller to get as much profit as they can.
Hmm,
So the application, but the concern about, for instance, management.
hmm,
Management is leadership.
hmm.
Sometimes it's dictatorial, and sometimes it's so. In some cases, like for instance, in a socialist environment, the managers would be elected by the workers.
Hmm.
So
Yes.
they would do that because he or she would be a person with a lot of knowledge, with a lot of understanding, and be able to lead a highly effective productivity,
Hmm. Yeah.
rather than somebody who sees labor as just as a commodity and
Hmm.
as an input, and wants to get as much as possible that they can out of the individual unit of labor, which
Yes.
what Marx sees the value coming as the number of units of labor that are put into a product compared to another product. So
Hmm.
if we had if these were equal, then we'd have perfect competition instead, or perfect exchange, not competition,
Yeah.
because of something of value X would be exchanged for something of value X.
Hmm.
That's not what capitalism does. Capitalism takes value X, increases it with profit, and
Hmm.
creates it X plus profit. So this causes inflation, and it makes it impossible for the person who provided the value to the value of X to buy this thing because it's X plus.
Hmm. Yes. And so in your view, then the manager would be part of the labor process.
Yeah.
Like you need, like, it's organization. So it's just, the problem is that that's not owned by the producers. Managers are sort of deployed by the owners of the means of production. So that means that it takes on almost a conflicting position with those that are actually, making the widgets.
Yeah.
When really making the widgets, transporting the widgets, managing the labor process to ensure that the widgets are produced efficiently and of high quality, that's all part of the management, is part of the labor that goes into the widget production.
Yeah. The management in a sense becomes part of what Marx called the petit bourgeois, the middle class,
Yeah.
because they are partly management. They
Yeah.
have the interests of management that they are exercising, but they also have the interests of the worker by leading them to do an effective job.
Mm.
But
Yes.
the interesting thing about uh, this is that managers and everybody else's income is added to the inputs
Mm.
because they have to be paid for.
Yeah.
So now we
Yeah.
have added all these things from the labor, fuel, uh, widgets, all kinds of things, and the total amount of that X
Yes.
is what it costs us, and now we have to add money to it in order to make a profit. We
Yeah.
can't sell it for that. And
Yeah.
we have, if we're going to exchange between workers, if we go to Marx's pure units of labor as being the value of something,
Mm.
what about the difference in the kinds of labor?
Mm.
Because there is expert labor and there's raw labor.
Yeah.
Now, if you're hired to, let's say, on a construction site, quite often some of the workers on a construction site can be brand new and simply pick up or unload trucks or carry bricks from one place to another. And then we have engineers who are work on the site and probably in an instructional way, but they are implying a skill that other workers don't have. Whereas everybody has the skill to pick up bricks and transfer them to another location as raw labor.
Mm.
We're going to pay these other people more. And when we look at the labor theory of value, we have to look at the collective labor that went into the product. Not we tend to see it as the individual laborer working and producing something as though we were making these individual things alone, which still happens in some cases. But generally, we have an overall collective, an amalgamation of labor inputs, and they each cost things, and they each cost differently. Some for all of the different things that go into it. So then we have to recognize that how are we going to evaluate the unit of the value of labor? We have to look at the final price that is charged, that arbitrary number, and work back and say, whatever input you had here, whatever proportion you had contributing to this, is the value that you put into it. So it's going to be more than the price is going to be more than you were paid for sure.
I liked it the way you said it before, which was, X plus profit. So if you take away the profit, if you just subtract the profit, like is it correct to say, price minus profit equals what was paid to labor?
Yeah.
So it's like, and that's kind of what you were saying before, where it is, how can labor afford to buy the products of society when it's got this, plus profit? It doesn't have the profit circulating within its ability to purchase things. It's been
that's exactly what inflation is.
Yeah.
And so then, of course, the worker has to be given more money.
Yes.
In order to buy the product.
Yeah.
And as soon as he needs more money, and as soon as the labor unions demand more money, the price of producing the product goes up, and therefore the price goes up again. So it keeps going one step ahead of the consumer, of the worker as a consumer. Well, we must recognize the distinction here between I lost my train of thought.
We were talking about labor plus X, labor plus profit equals price, I guess. That's kind of like, maybe I'm butchering that a bit, but how that is a correct way to think about it or not. But just because I think we have talked a bit about, I don't want to exclude other items which we want to get to. I'll take that as a signal to go forward to talk about the left, what's happened to so the labor theory of value. We both agree, I assume, that this is this recognition of that is fundamental to left-wing politics.
Yeah, so because it excuse me, it acknowledges and exemplifies class society.
Yes.
That we have a working class.
Yeah.
And most of the resistors don't want to hear that. That's why they bring in ideas and obscure things like that.
Yeah.
But once we have a recognition of class society, then we must start realizing the value of labor, and that is the only producer of value is labor.
Yes.
So now we have a whole different view of what our society should be like, and why we should have a socialist society in order to stop the conflict and in order to have human development ahead of economic development.
Yeah. But just to go back to the ideas thing for a second, would you see the people, like the thinkers within society, people who are doing research in a socialist society, would they be similar to managers, how we were seeing managers earlier? Like they're part of the labor process, because they're thinking up ideas which could be used to make products better or make production more efficient and so on, those kinds of things.
But ideas by themselves don't produce anything. When we had our kitchen remodeled, I spent a lot of time watching and observing these two really good, talented guys. And they were doing work, they were producing a
Yeah.
value,
Yeah.
but they were also thinking. They had a
Yeah.
lot of ideas and they had to use them all the time. They were making judgments about the size of things, what fit where, what is the most appropriate way to do things.
Mm,
So thinking is part of the labor process. It is when it is separated
mm,
that it attempts to negate the idea of the value of labor or
mm.
the labor theory of value.
Yeah.
But when it's separated, it doesn't do anything. When
Mm,
these guys were thinking of things, and I was amazed at how they would discuss things between them, the two of them,
mm.
about how to do it. Yeah, and then they'd come to this conclusion. They are thinking, and they are thinking creatively and coming to a conclusion. All part of what they're being paid for. They were skilled workers. They
But
weren't
if you,
moving bricks
but
from one
just as
place.
an example, if you had someone, let's say in a socialist context, who was just a philosopher, who was just engaged in putting together philosophical ideas, I'm just thinking, how is that considered to be labor, or no? That's just them. Like, I don't quite know how to conceptualize that. Like, I
My, my,
know that in order for
my
those,
screen just went off.
well, you're fine. You're still on here.
Am I?
Yeah. So continue.
Oh, well, okay.
Just continue. You won't be able to see yourself, but
I
or
won't
me.
be able to. Okay.
But go on, because we we can't edit this, so we just have to take
Okay.
it as
Sorry, I was very distracted by that. I've got a whole lot of stuff to read on here. But could you just briefly remind me what you were just saying?
well, I'm getting back to this ideas, this okay. So you have someone who's just engaged in philosophy, which putting forward those ideas, those philosophical ideas, is humans want to listen to this and everything, but I'm not quite sure how that's conceptualized if it's not like, it's not really very comparable to that example you were giving, where you have the two guys working on a kitchen and they're discussing how they're going to shape materials to make
Well,
cabinets.
I just did that to show that ideas don't exist. Ideas can contribute to value,
Yeah.
but they have to be contributing in the context of labor, not in the context of their abstraction.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
the thing I was thinking before about was surplus value.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to understand that the efficiency of labor uh, produces more than is actually required for the worker uh, to subsist. So we
Mm-hmm.
have this extra, and that's the surplus value is what contributes to all of these social services that workers produce and that everyone enjoys. Education and medicine would be two of them when we have socialized medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And that is part of, that's paid for by the labor, the value of the labor that was produced in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, humanity existed for a long time before education and medicine
Yes.
or health care. So we
Yes.
know that about because we could produce more value, more surplus than we needed, or that we could use it for other things,
Mm-hmm.
so that we could support workers in other areas.
Mm-hmm.
Because university teachers, university professors, and
Yeah.
doctors are fundamentally workers.
Yeah. Okay.
Just the way the guy who picks up garbage is a worker,
Yes.
all paid for by the surplus value created by the working class in general.
Okay. So in terms of this conception of labor being the base of everything, pretty much, and profit being related to class conflict, and this being a fundamental kind of thing for the left to accept. You've written, I guess it was a couple of years ago, and I actually posted, as I was mentioning to you, I posted this, your article on the Facebook page, just to give people a sense of your ideas. You see that there's been a drifting away from that amongst people who call themselves left wing. Is that correct?
Yeah, I remember the article now. What I'm looking at is what we're looking at is the postmodernism, which is the reaction, the negative or conservative reaction to the Enlightenment, which
Mhm.
advocated for reason and logic and science.
Yes.
Uh, and these these qualities came to the rejection of oppressive formations like capitalism,
Mm.
and the building of the left, the revolutions that occurred, uh, and the defeats of those revolutions, and all of that part of history that we're looking at. But the fundamental principle behind all left politics is class.
Mm.
And we see that what is occurring now and in the period is the confusion of class and a lot of other social forces like racism.
Mm.
So instead of, I mean, racism, there's absolutely no justification for racism, and it doesn't have any basis in logic. So we don't have to be concerned about it. Everybody agrees that racism is bad. In fact, anti-racism is a populist phenomenon.
Mhm.
Everybody agrees that we shouldn't be racist. I mean, I know fascists think we should, but
Mhm.
that doesn't matter. Our society doesn't function on the basis of wanting to be racist, but it does function on the basis of wanting to have separate classes. So
Mm.
one class can exploit the other. So
Mm.
instead of seeing the development of this and seeing how the left was going, in concentrating or focusing fundamentally on class and the class conflict, we're now bringing in other elements like race and saying that conflict is because of race rather than that conflict is because of the exploitation of one class of another.
So do you
And
think
what's
that that's
becoming
a this
what
distraction? Like, do you think that the reason why there's so much of a focus on this is to
oh
kind of
yeah.
divert attention away from class politics?
Oh, absolutely. And look how something like an absurdity like religion is jumping onto the piggybacking on the anti-racism, which is a logical thing that humanity will eventually, I'm sure, eliminate racism just by the fact that it doesn't make sense, not because not because of censorship or anything like that, but because there's no basis for it in the first place. But but we have other things like religion hopping on the bandwagon, and now we've got to get rid of racism and religion and opposition to religion. And we hear there was a thing the other day about the somebody criticizing the refugees and saying that when refugees from the Ukraine are accepted everywhere, but not the refugees from Arab states and Africa, and that's because of racism,
Mm.
because Arabs and Africans are defined by their race,
Mhm.
but the others are defined, well, yeah, by the race too. But that's not why. The difference is in the ideology of and that ideology that's coming out of Africa is Islam. And
Mm.
Islam has to be is an ideology that has to be confronted and discussed openly for what its role is in our in the world today. Is first of all, it's growing. It's well, I don't know if I should really be getting into this is another issue, but Islam is something that really has to
But
be of the
postmodernism doesn't want us to realize some of the negative aspects of that religious ideology.
yeah. It
So
doesn't want us to,
because
and
it sees
it
because
wants to
it
lump.
sees race, because race, everyone agrees that it doesn't make any sense to be opposed to someone else because of their race. That doesn't make sense, but it does make sense perhaps to be opposed to ideas that, have that argue for various, socially negative kinds of things. Postmodernism kind of encourages people to see everything in terms of race, as opposed to perhaps it's the religion, the religious ideology, which
Well,
is causing the conflict.
postmodernism distorts away from the reality of class conflict and attaches it to something that is logical, like anti-racism,
Hmm.
and so that we don't have that, and that has come to affect the left. That's where the left has gone, where
Hmm.
we have people who are so sure that they're right that they abandon any aspect of discussion or analyzing different points of view because they know what's right. And if so we can, and not only that, but there is the attachment of racism where it isn't even there.
Hmm.
So just call
Yes.
some, so everybody will agree because everybody generally does agree that racism is not something we can accept. So
Hmm.
we attach a whole lot of other things that we shouldn't accept onto racism, so that it can benefit from the logic of opposing racism and supporting the concept of the existence of races.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I think this is kind of, it seems to me, one of the fundamental aspects of postmodernism. And I think this is taken from Alan Sokal's work, is that it's kind of used as and that these aren't his words, but as sort of a monkey wrench that's thrown into things. So if you're trying to pursue an argument rationally, postmodernism throws a bunch of kinds of language-based objections, which make you confused, and then you get diverted onto another path. It seems to be and so you really don't have the kind of tools to be able to try and figure things out anymore, because they've been disrupted by, for example, conflating religion and race. So you're trying to figure out why it's disturbing that women are forced to wear various articles of clothing to preserve their modesty. You're thinking this through, and then you're told that your preoccupation with this is an indication of your racism, that you're racist. And so then you think, okay, well, I don't want to be thought of as a racist, so I'll just kind of leave that.
Well, another aspect of that is is a woman's right.
Yes.
Whereas it's like a slave's right to be a slave,
Hmm. Yes. That's not really a right. Like,
Of course,
I
it's
don't
not a
think
right.
anyone would argue that someone has a right to be a slave.
Yeah.
Like, that's not you don't use rights in that way. Like that's not, I don't quite like freedom to be a slave. You have the freedom to be a slave. Like, that's a contradictory idea to say it that way.
Yeah.
But with respect to these issues about
But
religion.
postmodernism has changed the orientation of oppressive things into rights.
Yes.
Like wearing religious attire, particularly Islamic religious attire, and particularly that toward women. I mean, all religious attire that women have in Islam is about their subjugation to men. They're not supposed to look at them. They're supposed to be covered up because they belong to their husband, or they are under the control of their fathers and fathers-in-law. So, I mean, these people it's an insult to men everywhere. When a woman wears something in order that I can't see her because if I do, then I will violate her. I find that offensive, and because I will not do that, and most people will not do that. Islamic men may do it because they think that that's the appropriate thing, and that it's natural because Islam tells them that men are naturally rapists, and women have to protect themselves from it by not exciting men, by showing their jewels, quote unquote.
Ornaments.
Complete offense to humanity.
Yes. Anyway, I think we'll leave that that area there for another day.
Happy to leave
But
Islam somewhere.
I want to get into things with you because we only have 15 minutes left. I know it's hard to believe on your segment. 2 points of, well, definitely one point of contention that you and I have, which is about the vaccine mandates. So
What?
You are a supporter of vaccine mandates?
Yep.
So could you just, I was wondering if you could just explain why you support vaccine mandates?
Well, we have an answer to the coronavirus, and that is for everybody to get vaccinated. So everybody should get vaccinated. That's it. This is in the interests of all of humanity. And if everybody were vaccinated, it would we would take care of it. That's how we got rid of polio. I don't know about the currently, but I know when I was a child, I had to get vaccinated for two things. I don't remember what they were before I went to school. My mother said, "We're going to the doctor and you're going to get vaccinated." I went to the doctor, got vaccinated, so I could go to school. There's nothing negative about that. And it's part of the continuation of seeing ourselves as a species instead of a bunch of competing individuals.
Mm-hmm. So you see the vaccine mandates, like because I think everyone agrees that under some instances, government regulation is necessary because we're not going to reach a socially positive outcome just by leaving things up to each individual to decide. And I think everyone realizes that things like traffic signals and so on, like that just doesn't work unless everyone agrees that on the red light everyone's going to stop and on the green light everyone's going to go. That you sort of see it as a similar thing to that, or is there something else as well that you see?
It's similar to that, but it's not that specific. I think that you can make that analogy. I just see that there's something that it is scientifically shown to be an effective way to deal with this situation. And there are people who are going to resist that. And that's too bad. You're simply going to have to do it. I'd like to go through red lights, but I can't.
But I'm just wondering, in terms of medical treatment, like a fundamental principle of medical treatment, which I think vaccines are an example, is consent, a patient's consent.
Well, I don't think they're a treatment because you only treat something that already exists. If you, they're not I don't know what the medical term would be, but they're not something that corrects what you already have. They are something to prevent you from having it.
But medical interventions of some kind, like medical, I don't know the exact word, but the idea fundamentally is that if you're going to be doing something to someone's body,
like getting a 5-year-old to be vaccinated so they can go to school.
Yes. So consent, though, is a principle of that. So it's parental consent, usually in the case of children, and then it's the consent of the patient, the person, the adult, which is a fundamental principle. And I'm wondering, do you see this as being a problem for that idea of consent to be kind of imposing vaccines on people?
Well, I don't think it's a question of consent. My mother told me that I had to do it in order to go to school.
Yes.
So I had to do it.
Yes. But do you think that the vaccines at that time, do you see them as having any differences with the current vaccines?
No, I don't.
You see them
No,
as being
nothing
the same?
fundamental.
So like when people say these vaccines have only been around for a couple of years, we don't know the long-term health effects. We're still kind of learning about them. Could there be a problem with forcing people to get these treatments, which
Well,
are
why would it be a problem for some people and not others?
well, in
These
cases
people
that
are
I
asking for a privilege.
well, in cases that
I'm
I
against
know, you
privilege.
have people who have particular health conditions which have not been investigated in the context of the vaccine trials.
Well,
So you
I
have
think that we have to go with
so for
science.
example, autoimmune disorders or cancer, various forms of cancer and so on, and worries that this could somehow trigger a particular response in them, which has not been properly investigated by the authorities.
So these people are superseding science. They know more than science.
Well, science is. I would take personally. I would take exception with using science. Science is a method of investigation,
Yeah.
and you have ongoing revision and new studies and so on. So it's kind of the compilation of the studies that have been done. But if you haven't done any of the studies yet, it's something that the scientific research is silent on at that particular time. So it's not saying it's opposed to the existing scientific research that's been done. It's just saying that because it's only been a couple of years in, we haven't really been able to do all the studies with all the various kinds of complications that potentially could occur.
That logic says nobody should get them.
Well, like
we're all subject to that.
all I can do to speak for myself is that I'm a person who's got vaccinated. I don't have any issues. I have no health conditions. Like I don't have any conditions to be concerned about. But if I were a person who had
Okay, but
conditions,
when,
then I
when
might
people
feel
go
different.
when people go to their doctor and tell them about these conditions, the doctors have said, the scientists have said, those are reasons why you should get vaccinated, not why you shouldn't.
But if the studies,
That's
but
been
if
a consistent
but if
claim.
the studies haven't been done, if the studies haven't been done yet, for example, of people with autoimmune disorders, there was never any attempts to, like, let's say hypothetically, that the studies haven't been done. Like, I'm not an expert. At this point, I just trust the medical. I have trust in the establishment of medicine and so on, to say, okay, well, and I don't have any particular concerns myself. But I do know of people who have concerns, and they're saying things like the studies just haven't been done. So I've got to kind of, just take it on faith that there's not going to be some kind of screw up that happens with my system, with my particular thing. And since there's no studies that have been done about it, my doctor can't know one way or another about the effects of vaccines on this particular condition.
The amount of knowledge, that scientific knowledge that we have is minuscule compared to the amount of knowledge that we don't have and that we will learn in the future. But this is what we have to date. The people who are saying this are not scientists. They're people, first of all, who have some other reason, and they're looking for it. They're selective. They're ignoring the reality of and the positive things because they want their own way. And I don't know if they're afraid of needles or whatever it is, but they're rising up to oppose this, to talk about there's not enough. That reminds me of the time when the cigarettes were still prominent and popular, and the cigarette companies were getting doctors to say that we need more research. So all of the people that the 2-pack-a-dayers getting lung cancer would say to you, but there's not enough research, right? That's exactly the same argument. As much as we know, as much as modern science is today, we should get the vaccine. And that means everybody should.
All right. Final point of contention. Well, not point of contention, because I don't know really what to think about it. But I do know you do have some strong opinions on this
I do
subject,
have a few, yeah.
which is the trucker convoy. I wanted to ask you about the trucker convoy, because I do have interactions with people who see it as some kind of revolt against sort of the intellectual elites. Some people see it as a working class kind of opposition to sort of the totalitarian impulses of the current system. But I know that you have a different view of the trucker convoy. And I was wondering if you could just explain what your view is on that.
Well, certainly, let's get back to you're suggesting a worker here.
I just heard that mentioned. That's not my, I've heard people say that.
Okay, I've heard them say that too.
Yes.
But they don't understand class society, and they don't understand the concept of the petit bourgeois, which is always the groundwork or the genesis of when fascism arrives in various social circumstances. These are people conflicting in the middle between their interests, between they don't want to be working class and they resent the capitalist class. But the people, the workers, not the workers, the drivers who were violating the law, blocking streets, demanding a change in government and all that, are not workers. They are not part of the working class. They are petit bourgeois and they own their own trucks. That is a reality here. And when we look at the middle class, which is what they are, that's why they can take a truck and spend all that time and money with it, just being there to annoy people in Ottawa, rather than transporting goods over the border and getting the goddamn shot that they should get. So if these people can do that, do you think a trucking company allows their workers to take a truck, a means of production, a thing that creates profit for them, and do what they want with it, and spend weeks camped outside of residential areas in Ottawa? Of course not. And none of the workers, the unionized workers, have been opposed to that. They didn't join it. They didn't do anything like that. They are petty bourgeois, middle-class people who own $200,000 units of production. A truck is like a factory in the sense of it is there to produce value. And the value that it produces is transmitting a product or a commodity from one place to another. The third P in the marketing mix, place. The value of something is at its ultimate value when it's in the place where you can get it. And that's why we need trucking. So that's what they were, and that's what it was. And look how all of the conservative elements supported them. And they had a fascist element within them,
So how did they have a fascist element within them?
Well, first of all, they were going against the existing democratic regime, which is fascistic, as it happened in the Spanish Civil War.
Well, not all. Like you can have going against the existing regime from the left as well, like from a socialistic position. I'm not saying that they're socialistic, but I don't. Just because they're going against the existing regime doesn't mean that's evidence of some fascistic kind of character.
Socialist opposition is against the capitalist system, not against the existing government that happens to be there.
But you might be right-wing government that you're like, you could have left-wing elements opposed to right-wing policies of a government, and not necessarily be socialistic, but be coming at the situation from the left,
Well,
a more equal kind of society.
there was no representation from whatever is left of the left in that dispute.
Hmm.
That was all
I'm not-
individualistic.
I don't have a very good sense of it. I was just trying to get your. I've heard a bunch of different.
Look at the cache of arms that were there.
Yeah, well, and I'm not sure if that is a fair characterization of, especially the Ottawa protest, which seemed to me to be a peaceful protest, like annoying and obstructionist and so on, but didn't seem to have any violent character to it. The one in Ottawa.
Yeah, but it just had it had the same principles behind it, though. It's just that it hadn't gone that far right as the one in the West.
Yeah. Anyway, well, that's been very interesting, Albert. I'm not sure if you know this or not, but we have come up to about the hour point now with respect to this questioning. So it's only fair now that you have your time to be able to ask me questions that you have
Sure.
been thinking about over the next hour. And maybe we can get into some more of this, whatever we were talking about, or it can be completely new subjects that you want to raise.
Yeah, is there no way that I can get to see you when I'm talking to you? Because it's difficult when I can't see your lips moving, for a start. But I'm looking at this thing. It's giving me instructions here, and there's no way we can overcome that, is it?
Well, I don't know. I can't see it, so I don't know how to do it.
Ditch the
If you can,
40-minute limit, experience and advanced collaboration
if you can struggle through,
for
because we can't
limited
edit
time,
this,
save
so,
30%, upgrade to pro.
Albert, you can't. I'd have to
Sorry,
go
I
up.
can't do that. Okay, I'm going to move on now.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Well, great. Okay. I had prepared some questions that I'd like to discuss with you.
Okay.
And one is, first of all, the situation that you are finding yourself in today at the university and the indigenization of the university. And there's no agreed upon definition of that. So I want to know how you would characterize it.
Well, there's two kinds of terms which are bandied about with respect to this. One is indigenization and the other is decolonization. And so it's perhaps helpful to contrast those two terms. And indigenization is adding in indigenous culture to the university. So the university continues pretty much as it is, and you have new indigenous cultural things added. So you have, courses which have indigenous content. You have more indigenous professors and students. You have targeting mechanisms for that. You have indigenous artwork, which is added to the university, and so on. So that's indigenization. And then, of course, the indigenous ways of knowing, which was my biggest, point of contention that I was taking to the university about it. So that's indigenization, which is contrasted with decolonization. And decolonization is taking out. So it's actually removing things from the university, which are considered to be colonialist. And while I have problems with indigenization, because I see them as some of the features as lowering standards in the university, much worse is what's called decolonization, because that seems now to be targeted at revising history. So, for example, removing books from the library that are considered to not portray indigenous people in the way that some neo-tribal elites want Indigenous people to be portrayed as. We have a terrible thing happening in the Library and Archives Canada, where they're kind of cleansing their archival. I don't exactly know how far they're going to go with it, but some complaints were received about some article on Johnny MacDonald, and they're currently scrubbing the record of all these what's considered to be colonialist kinds of perspectives in the archives. So I think indigenization has a lot of problems about, adding in aspects of Indigenous culture, depending upon what those are and how easily they fit with the university's academic character. But we seem to be going on the path now towards what's called decolonization, which is actually, taking out important features of the university.
What about the actual imposition of elements? Like I remember seeing a few presentations prior to it a couple of years ago at the university, and to ready the university for what it's going to be like when it's indigenized. Much were a lot of prayers,
Yes.
smudging, and other unscientific
Yeah.
ceremonies
Yeah.
were put in. How everyone was supposed to understand this
Yeah.
and participate. Has there been any of that imposed?
Yeah, so that's one of the negative aspects. So that would be an aspect of indigenization, because you're adding Indigenous culture into the to the system, and that was one of the biggest things. And territorial land acknowledgements is another one, but the prayers was particularly problematic. We're going to use that term because the university is supposed to be a secular institution, and if people want to pray, then that's their own business. But what was happening was that in order to be indigenized, you would have just regular events which had nothing to do, they didn't even have anything to do with indigenous people as specifically. For example, the president, when the new president was starting, the people who organized the welcoming event for him made sure that they brought in an elder to give a blessing at the beginning of the welcoming. And so it was like, if people want to go and pray, that's something they can organize on their own, so that they're not imposing that and putting people like me and anyone else who is opposed to prayers, like I don't accept that. Like I don't accept that as being a valuable thing to be doing, and I think it's actually harmful for people to be praying. It kind of forces us into this kind of complicity with it, and it gives the impression that we're somehow agreeing with it, that we want this to be happening, and I think that sort of thing is one of the largest problems with these indigenous kinds of initiatives.
The institution of praying and other spiritual elements associated with Aboriginal people implies that is their nature, and that is implicit with being Aboriginal. So that means that since these things are completely irrational, that Aboriginal people are necessarily irrational as a group.
And it could be seen as racist, that you assume because of the ancestry of a particular group of people that they just want to pray all the time. Like that's kind of their nature, is that those people like to pray. And so, and I found that to be very offensive as well, because I actually do know, I know a couple of Indigenous, certainly one who's an atheist, and then I'm not sure if you remember Bill Watani, who was a friend of mine, and some extent yours. I used to go for lunch with him, and he said, I really don't like this, having prayers all the time. I don't think that's a good thing to be having that. So what does it say to people like Bill Watani that, he's now got to have this being done supposedly in his name, which is very insulting to him as a rational person who doesn't want to be continuously subjected to these irrational practices at the university. And that's not to say anything, and people often confuse this, that you want to stop people from praying, you want to, that's got, people are free at any time to pray. Like, no one wants to stop people from praying. The problem is bringing it into an event which has nothing to do with that, and then somehow pretending that everyone is supportive of this happening. That's the difficulty with it.
Yeah. What's going on in the residential schools today?
Yes.
What's
Well, this is
just a, you know, a catch up of what's really happening.
Yeah. So this is one of the most sort of developments that is becoming well, there was a certain amount of hysteria that was happening with respect to it, which I guess was building after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued their report, then there was this kind of consolidation that everyone, you know, sort of agreed that the residential schools were this just absolutely terrible house of horrors that were occurring. And then we had the Murder to Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, which declared that, you know, genocide, not cultural genocide, which the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was being perpetrated. And then the sort of the idea that the residential schools were actually genocide in terms of the actual intentional destruction of a group, not just getting people to you know, speak English and not practice their religious ceremonies, but actually trying to destroy the group itself. And then we had the Kamloops case where ground penetrating radar had indications of 200 to 215 soil disturbances, which then got blown up into this idea that somehow there had been children buried in this apple orchard. No evidence whatsoever of this exists, and it's a highly improbable scenario, because if you're going to bury children clandestinely in an orchard, you don't wake up children, 6-year-old children, in the middle of the night to dig the graves, which were the sort of the stories. And then as well, babies being thrown into furnaces, and this has really been accepted by even, you know, well-known neo-tribal elites like Sinclair, the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Murray Sinclair, yeah.
Murray Sinclair. Anyway, so that was all kind of coming to a head. And then now I'm involved with a research group of about 15 people who are doing intensive research on the residential schools and are pushing back against you know, all these claims that are being made without scrutiny. Like they aren't, there's been no kind of critical analysis of what's being put forward by the Aboriginal industry to a large extent, neo-tribal elites and so on, and, you know, academics who are quote unquote woke, which means, you know, proponents of identity politics that have a sort of a totalitarian character to them. So there's been a number of articles now published in the Dorchester Review, and I had a recent piece published in the American Conservative that was talking about the lack of evidence which existed for these kinds of claims. And we're hoping that by, you know, distributing these pieces to journalists and to politicians and to academics, that we can start to have more of a rational discussion about the residential schools, which is kind of, you know, been diverted, very seriously diverted since the publication of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report.
Well, in Truth and Reconciliation, there perhaps should be a little more emphasis on truth.
Yes, well, the funny thing is that Ronald Neetzen wrote a book called I think it's called Truth and Indignation. Anyway, so in that book, he sort of talks about how truth, according to the neo-tribal elites and the Aboriginal industry, is not meant the same way. It's not the same definition as truth for the Enlightenment type of view of truth. So the Enlightenment view of truth is a universal that we're all trying to work towards and trying to gather evidence to search for and to move towards. Truth for the neo-tribal elites is their subjective viewpoint. And so, of course, we have plenty of the quote unquote truth, which is the subjective viewpoint, but truth, the Enlightenment position of truth as a universal has been completely mowed over by these political kinds of
Well,
considerations.
the Enlightenment view of truth is that it's subjective.
Yes.
And I think that the subjectivity is the basis of postmodern reasoning. It's who likes what and how somebody feels about something.
Yes.
So this is a definite weapon of stopping freedom of speech and generally censorship. I don't like that, so you can't say it.
Yes, and to just elaborate upon that a little bit is that wokeism, which is the colloquial term that we use for what James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose call reified postmodernism. That's the term they use, which I think is helpful because it's talking about postmodernism as this relativistic type of position. But in the reified form, there's an insistence that you accept certain viewpoints. And it's the viewpoints of people who are perceived to be the most oppressed. And that's why the indigenous file is so rife with postmodernism, is because indigenous people are seen as being the most oppressed group or more oppressed than other groups. So if you have, well, I think even more oppressed perhaps than the Black population. Indigenous people are seen as being more oppressed because they were the original inhabitants who had everything taken from them and so on. But the idea of reified postmodernism is that whatever an indigenous person says has to be accepted, because you have to aid in assisting them in overcoming their oppression. Their identities must be made real. So you must go along with whatever it is that they think is the case. And this has created, huge problems now because we can't really have because we lost the kind of the universality that you're talking about. So the Enlightenment was about universality and trying to reach a common understanding through reason and the scientific method, and that everyone could be involved in that. Like, it didn't matter what your gender was or your sex was or what your race was or what your sexual orientation was or anything like that. That didn't matter. As long as you were able to use these methods, which had been honed over time, you could be a contributor to the search for truth and the movement towards truth. And that has been completely lost now.
Yeah, they want to preclude open discussion.
Yes, and because it's so contradictory, like that's what you tend to find, is that you can't really, it doesn't really make sense. And generally, I think that's why I think that postmodernism is actually very dishonest. I find it to be dishonest because someone who's a postmodernist, like they'll argue the universal case when it suits them, and then revert to the relativistic case. It's called, it's an interesting, there's a number of terms for this, but one is the Mott and Bailey kind of strategy. It's a military term. I'm not sure if you've heard of this before. but the Bailey is the sought after fertile valley, and the Motte is the dank and dark castle on the hillside. And so your goal is to get the Bailey. That's what you want. And that is, that's the relativist, like you use the relativism to get the sought after thing. But when you're challenged on it, you revert to the Motte, which is the dark and dank castle of, universality and scientific method and so on. So it's this constant kind of, well, others have called it the radical truistic shuffle. I believe it's Joseph Carroll who calls it that, which is, the meaning of the word is either radical and interesting and untrue, or banal and true. And depending upon if you put forth the radical untrue kind of assertion, and when you get challenged on it, then you say, no, I wasn't meaning that. I was meaning this banal, true idea. And it's this constant changing that happens in the postmodernist discourse. And you notice that a lot in the indigenous kind of file, is that these kinds of tactics are used so that everyone's constantly disoriented and we can't figure out what's actually happening.
I wanted to I wanted to ask you a question about, to change the subject, of feminism. Feminism has been divided into categories of gender and equity feminism. And I find this very, very interesting.
Yes.
What is the distinction between them, and what comment can you make?
So that view, and we just had an interesting discussion about this on the Facebook page, because my colleague Janice Fiamengo, who's a board member for the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, calls herself an anti-feminist. And I'm in disagreement with Janice about this, because I'm a feminist. I consider myself to be a feminist, but I certainly see that there's been some developments within feminism which have been very destructive. And I think we have to work hard at trying to, see what was beneficial and what was a problem with respect to feminist discussions. And Christina Hoff Sommers was the theorist who actually made this very, very important distinction, which kind of clarified a few things, because in political science, we used to learn about liberal, Marxist, and radical feminism. That those were kind of the three categories, and then that was kind of confusing to have the three, because liberal feminism and Marxist feminism have a lot in common and can actually be lumped together as equity feminism. And it's the radical feminism, or at least some aspects of the radical feminist kind of variant, that would be what Hoff Sommers calls gender feminism. And the equity feminism is about equal rights for men and women. So
social equality.
Yeah. So and there would be differences. And that's where the Marxist and the liberal feminism comes, because the liberal feminists, focus on the legal side of things, and then the Marxist feminists would focus on the economic side of things. But still, they wouldn't be wanting to, make arguments like the gender feminists do, which you do see, about female, or at least, well, this gets into another angle. Sort of female superiority, so that the women have some kind of superior kinds of qualities which men should defer to, and this kind of got into all sorts of problems, because it was being used as a weapon by certain opportunistic elements within feminism to do this, to press for various things, and to overturn important principles. One of them being that the presumption of innocence. So the presumption of innocence is a very, very important principle that has been built up over hundreds of years within the common law system. Anyway, the kind of radical feminists or the gender feminists had this idea of "we believe you" as their slogan, which, you know, causes immediate concern for those who are part of the equity feminist camp, because it seems to threaten the presumption of innocence. Because to say "we believe you" for someone who is saying that they've been sexually assaulted means that you automatically think that the man who's done it is guilty, and that's a problem. And you know, what they really should have as their slogan, if it was an equity feminist, would be, you know, "we don't disbelieve you." So we're not going to make any judgments about, you know, what you're wearing or anything like that. It's going to be, you know, it's going to be letting the evidence come forward and then make a decision. But it's not going to, there's not going to be prejudice that's going to be displayed towards you. But as well, we have to also accept that you know, the man who's being accused is entitled to the presumption of innocence, which is a very important principle. So I think that's a good example of how equity feminism versus gender feminism would kind of see those kinds of cases. And then we've even got into more kind of strange territory with trans activism. So trans activism in its most extreme forms denies the existence of biological sex and says that, you know, whether you're a woman or not is determined by what you feel, which of course is the postmodern, like that's postmodernism.
Sure.
Running amok.
Completely subjective.
Running amok. And that is, I think that is the most extreme postmodernist position, is the position that you see in trans activism. And I'm hoping that since it's the most extreme, it's going to be the first to fall and just fall in on the weight of its own contradictions. But it's doing a lot of damage. It's doing a lot of damage while it's in its ascendancy.
Postmodernism.
Yes, it's
damaging,
like
all right.
the most obvious case, and it's the most obviously irrational type of position that we're seeing, because really it's like one of those cases where someone where a group is pretending to be oppressed. Like that's what it seems to me, is that it's like people who, you know, argue for something which is impossible, and then when they can't get what they want, they say that this is somehow oppressing them. So I think this is one of the most extreme kinds of postmodernist examples that we've seen, and I'm hoping that it's coming to its end, the end of its pendulum swing, maybe. But I've thought that for I've thought this for a couple of years now, and it hasn't happened. But still, we'll see.
Well, I think a simplification to me of gender feminism is the suggestion that there's an intrinsic conflict between men and women that must be fought, and it's not going to go away.
Yes. Yep.
And,
Yep. And that's
I've known people to believe that.
This is a good point. And I should mention that this is and this is why I see radical feminism as being the area that took a wrong turn. Like the trans, it's kind of interesting with the trans activism stuff, because there's actually a split in radical feminism between sort of the lesbian kind of contingent that sees trans activism as trying to erase lesbianism, because they say, you know, that if you're a woman who's attracted to women, you should be in fact attracted to these men who now say that they're women. And this was very, very objectionable to the lesbian side of things. And then you have the trans activists who are saying that if you believe you're a woman, you're a woman. There's no such thing as biological sex, and so on. Anyway, the wrong turn, apart from like sort of the delinking of sex and gender, which happened, was also this focus on patriarchy. So that's the distinguishing feature of radical feminism, and also, I would assume, this gender feminism, is that patriarchy is seen as the most significant site of oppression in human beings. So, and patriarchy is this pervasive thing that seems well, I'm not sure if all radical feminists argue this, but certainly as a strand that seems to be just a intrinsic aspect to humans, that men have this innate desire to control women reproductively so that they can make sure that their children are their children. That seems to be what patriarchy is arguing. And of course, that seems to be abstracting patriarchy from its historical and material conditions. So it's not, I don't think it's true that men always try to control women's reproduction. Like, that's not, that it depends upon, and of course Engels's theory about this was that it was private property. Yep. That led to that control. So once you had inheritance, then you had an interest in controlling the bloodline, because you wanted to make sure that your property would pass on to your offspring, to your actual offspring, and not another man's offspring. Yeah. So that's one kind of thing. And as well, so if you had socialized kinds of processes, then why would men want to? Now you could argue, I guess, a evolutionary biology kind of argument, that like a selfish gene kind of argument, I guess, that like it's in your interest.
That's not separate from what Engels is saying, really.
Well, you could have another reason besides just the inheritance, right? Because you might want to have as many children possible as you could have possible, like as many children as possible. And it doesn't matter then whether about inheritance. The inheritance is a secondary issue, perhaps. I'm just saying it's possible, I guess, to make the argument from the basis of evolutionary biology.
But there would have to be some material reason for you to want to have as many children as possible.
Well, to expand your genetic presence.
Well, yeah. Why,
right?
though?
That would unless be the evolutionary,
unless you have some material to pass along.
No, but just the selfish gene idea that we're all gene machine, like the human body and everything is the gene machine that is there to make sure as many genes as possible get passed on. And that's kind of a separate issue than inheritance, making sure that your inheritance is going to those that have your genes. But I think there's a complex interplay between the two, which is quite interesting. But one needs to kind of root this in human history and look at different types of societies and the relationships between men and women and so on. And you do see in indigenous societies, you have what's called matrilineal societies, where sexual reproduction happens outside the group, and then the men who are living within that community are all related, are all biologically related.
Yeah.
to the women. So when you have biological relationships between the men and women, there's great cooperation that exists between them. So that's another kind of feature that could be examined.
How much time do we have left?
We have about 25 minutes.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. What do you think is the, to get off to another subject, what would you say off the top is the most pressing problem facing humanity today? I know that's a broad thing, but you could pick one of a number, I guess.
Well, the environmental situation, I guess, is probably a major one, but then that's kind of linked into capital. Like, I don't think one can separate. I think it's a mistake to separate the environmental situation from the problems of late capitalism. So I guess if I was to look at the root problem, is we're in a period of what's called late capitalism, and capitalism is on the downside of its trajectory. And I think that in order to try and deal with the environmental situation, try to deal with all these other kinds of problems, we need to have another kind of mode of production. I think that the capitalist system is fundamentally unsustainable, and it sort of, and that's the important thing to state is, and I think that's not stressed enough, is that capitalism at a particular point in time was progressive. So it allowed people to be taken out of feudalism and the horrors of the aristocracy and so on. It also allowed for detribalization of people, so that we were, relating to one another as individuals as opposed to relating to one another as members of tribes and so on. So there was great benefits that capitalism brought at a particular point in time, but now capitalism has reached its end point of its usefulness and is starting to disintegrate. Things are starting to disintegrate.
It's on the downside of its trajectory.
And that's your, like, I sometimes, Albert, I have to apologize to you sometimes, because we talk all the time and I absorb many of the things that that you put forward, and you're the one who actually raised the downside of the trajectory kind of idea of capitalism, which, the more I thought about it, the more I thought, wow, that I think that's true. I think that's what's occurring. And, something, it's not going to go on forever. And what's going to take its place? Like, what's going to be the next kind of system, which I think it's completely correct to say, we can't predict the future, and we don't know what's going to be coming next, but we can see the unsustainable character.
But we can see that the only alternative, if we're going to do away with capitalism, we're still going to have to eat, and we're going to have to reorganize our productive system, and that would be socialism. And socialism is threatening all the time, but it's postmodernism is moving in, and the logic of that we would come to realize that capitalism's overproduction and use of fossil fuels in order to maintain profits is what's destroying the environment. We have to reorganize society in order to keep ourselves going. And postmodernism keeps telling us that this is just part of another cycle, like the Ice Age, and all of the incredibly industry-supported research that is showing us that we have nothing to worry about. And we got people like Donald Trump who tell us that, the whole right. And that is postmodernism in action. All of the progress that we're seeing, we've got to do something about this destruction that capitalism is doing. We've got this tremendous pro-capitalist, postmodern influence.
So that's an interesting thing which we didn't get into very much in your segment. So postmodernism is pro-capitalist in your
Well,
view?
yeah, capitalism is the state that we're in,
Yeah.
and postmodernism is conservative, so it wants to keep capitalism.
Yes. Because it doesn't really stand like it's trying to in its opposition to socialism. Like, I guess that's one of the kinds of characteristics of
Its opposition is to logic and reason,
yeah,
which are proponents of the Enlightenment.
yes.
Logic and reason leads us to get rid of an oppressive situation like capitalism and look to another form of social organization where we eliminate that conflict.
Mhm.
And that sense, and since postmodernism is resistant to the Enlightenment, which would lead to that, the Enlightenment did lead to the Russian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, the attempts in China, and so on. And we're looking at these things and seeing how did they all fail? Because they did. They never really reached a fully socialist economy. And that is consistent with the idea that you can't have socialism in one country. It has to be universal. Workers of the world, Marx said, unite. He didn't say workers over here compete with each other.
Yeah.
Sorry to be
No, but I think that's these are kinds of ideas, because I think that I understand postmodernism's relativistic character, its anti-enlightenment kinds of posture and so on. What I find a bit of difficulty with is saying, things are like, I understand the problems of capitalism and how capitalism is unsustainable and so on, but I'm not sure that the next thing is going to be socialism. Like that's a prediction, seems to be a prediction, which is a difficult one to make, in terms of from a scientific standpoint.
But it's hard to come up with any other alternative.
Well, there's kind of
third way,
reversion to tribalistic kinds of scenarios, right? Like
you go backward instead of forward.
Well, it's possible that will happen. If you're looking at contraction of systems, then you go back to previous forms that were able to exist in systems of lower productivity, and tribalism is the one that seems to be well, we are being to some extent seeing the reassertion of various tribalistic types of tendencies within the system.
Yeah.
Like, well, I think that's partly the indigenous, the attraction of the indigenous.
That's reaction.
Yeah, it's reaction. So, like, historically, indigenous politics would never have been seen in a, in a kind of a positive light as going to be the future.
That's right.
But because we are kind of going on the downside of the trajectory, we see those kinds of circumstances to be like they're more and more entering into our kind of discourse and so on, which I don't think, if people were not romantic about it, which is one of the problems, is
objective about it.
If we don't have a highly developed division of labor, legal, rational kinds of forms of authority, scientific educational systems, which is kind of our, sort of the three, enlightenment gifts of the Enlightenment, I guess, is that we have those three things that we didn't have before the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
And
they threaten the status quo.
Life is going to be nasty, brutish, and short. Like this is not going to be a good thing to lose those three, jewels of the Enlightenment that were so hard fought for, that we fought for for so long. Now, certainly because they occurred in the capitalist context, you know, and I guess that's kind of some of the problems with the current discussions is that, you know, there's a lot of very, very oppressive characteristics of capitalism that people don't recognize when they're talking about sort of Enlightenment characteristics. But still, it was progressive in comparison to feudalism, slavery, tribalism, and so on that occurred before it.
Well, yeah, since we're on the subject of postmodernism, we should not see postmodernism as an ideology. It's not.
Yes.
It's simply an oppressive reaction to progress. It's a bulwark against what the Enlightenment stood for.
Yes.
And it's a maintaining of the status quo. This happens all the time. Every time some new phenomenon occurs, whatever exists that is threatened by it will resist.
Yes.
And we have to overcome it. Sometimes that resistance is correct. Sometimes we've had resistance to various medical procedures, like bleeding.
Yes.
Get rid of that bad blood and cure your disease. That was resisted by logic and so on, that existed prior to that. So that people were bled to death, and some of them survived, and so on and so forth. But there was this resistance, this thing that said we got to stop doing that, and it was correct. So the bleeding was not a positive thing. It was an attempt for science to move forward, but science operates on taking on experimentation, that's what it was.
Which reminds me,
unfortunately, experimentation was with humans.
Which reminds me, Albert, I forgot about this, but since we have some time, I should ask you about this. So this came from the Facebook discussions this morning, and the objection to your piece on postmodernism. I'm wondering, and this person, philosophy professor, was arguing, is making statements such as, there are no objectively true values, and there are no objective truths in our normative world. But like I don't quite know what that means exactly, but I'm wondering about the area of morality, postmodernism and morality. Are there objectively true values? Like what about morality? Is there a way to say one system of morality has more truth to it or is more valid than other systems of morality?
We have to see morality in the context of personal and social. And I think morality, to me anyway, is personal. And we have the result of when people have different morals or different senses of morality is the conflicts that exist that have to be resolved. So the woman at Mount Royal who insisted that somebody take a hat off because she didn't like what it said on it, that's her morality. And my morality is that he should wear whatever hat he wants. Now, those two things are in conflict. And what kind of a society are we going to evolve to down the road? Somebody who goes around telling what other people should wear or are allowed to have on their hat, or someone who says you have a right to wear whatever hat you want.
But is it just like you like chocolate and I like vanilla? Like what is the, like this?
Those are not moral questions.
Yeah, but it seems to me like this has always been something that's interested me, is, you know, I have a view of what I think would be a better society. And for example, I was just reading Bertrand Russell this morning, and one of the reasons why he's opposed to communism is because he does not think it's a system that will be able to bring about more happiness than other systems, according to him. So his test there is how much happiness will a system bring about, right?
How does he know what happiness will be brought about in the first place?
Well, like,
All communism would do is eliminate the negatives of capitalism.
I'm not getting into that argument at this stage. I'm just saying his standard for evaluating something, like whether or not it will or won't is one question, but the other one is this is his way. I guess that's his morality. Is
So it's
that
his interpretation of communism.
no, but he's judging systems on the basis of whether they will increase human happiness, or I think Sam Harris says it in the opposite, which is decrease human suffering, the extent to which they will decrease human suffering. It's the same kind of, it's the two sides of the same coin. That's how they evaluate proposals, is according to that standard. But is that true? Is that true, or is that just kind of an opinion that is something that we individually would like to see? It's like a value judgment which cannot be substantiated, just except for on the basis of, I think that would be a better world to live in than another kind of world.
The objective for human beings is for us to self-actualize. And the subjective concept like happiness doesn't make sense, since something that makes one person happy makes another person unhappy. So that's not a consideration. But what about the individual self-actualization, becoming the most complete human being they can be?
Yes.
And all we have to be concerned about that is not what that will do, but what is stopping it. And we have to eliminate the conflicts in the world that are stopping this kind of thing. And almost all conflicts have to do with resources.
So in terms of your view, then, the system that brings about the most self-actualization of people is the best system, and perhaps the most moral system.
Yes, I guess I would say that, yeah.
And is that true? Like,
is it true?
It's your view. Like you're making a case for that.
Abraham Maslow and I are putting it out there for people to consider.
Yes, but how do we evaluate it, I guess, is the question that I have. Like I would tend to agree. Like, I've always been a bit bothered by happiness, like that happiness because it seems to me to be slightly frivolous. Almost, it almost seems like a frivolous.
Some people are at their happiest when they go to a dogfight.
It's true. It doesn't. It seems to be
happiness
slightly.
Is not my objective.
Yeah. Whereas self-actualization and becoming the most complete human being that you can become.
Yeah.
Because we are, it's almost like that Platonic kind of idea of the essence of something. That what is it to be human? And then whatever it makes us the most of is kind of the most of the evolved, is the most evolved, is the most, almost kind of seems to me to be the most substantiated claim.
You mean according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
Well, I'm just trying to justify it philosophically, I guess, or scientifically, that position, as opposed to, so we have one view, which is the greater happiness, to bring about the most happiness. We have another view, which is seen as the best kind of system. The other view, which is to bring out the most self-actualization.
Yeah, to be fulfilled.
Regardless of whether it brings more happiness or not, right? But how do we evaluate which one is more convincing or truthful or valid or whatever the terms we're going to use, but to make a judgment out of which one to choose.
Well,
as
what is the criteria and what we're looking for here?
Well, I don't know. Like that's what I'm trying to figure out.
But I mean, you're saying which one is, so you're making a comparison.
Well, I'm
If we're
saying
going to
that,
compare them, we have to have some kind of an objective.
yeah, but there's this kind of
I'm
idea
not
of,
buying happiness,
what's that?
and I'm not buying happiness as that objective. Can you imagine a world full of happy people, all giggling and tickling each other?
But just because
Boy,
you
there's
don't
more to
like,
life than that.
just because you personally don't like it,
I didn't say I didn't like it.
well, you said imagine a room full of a whole bunch
Well,
of
some things make me happy, some things make me unhappy, and that's all within the realm of my sense of values and my morality. The things that don't make me happy or make me unhappy
yeah,
are things that I will rail against and
yeah,
persist against.
yeah,
Dogfighting makes me unhappy,
yeah,
and I am going to do everything I can to stop that.
yeah.
And that will make me more enhanced as a human being, that I've done away with this.
But is that subjective? Is that in the end subjective, or is there some objective? Can there be some sort of objective
there's no way
analysis you
somebody
brought to
can,
bear on it?
but there's no way somebody can find a satisfactory thing on the basis of the suffering of something else. That's a psychological problem. That's close to insanity.
Hmm.
I live in an environment, a world with a whole lot of other living things,
Mm-hmm.
and I have to. If I see myself as part of that and proceed through that, then I will reach, a sense of self-achievement, or whatever Maslow calls it.
Hmm. Yes, self-actualization.
But Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a very interesting thing that everybody should look at,
Mhm.
and realize that we have a place in the world, that we take a place in the world, and it can be full of conflict or it could be full of cooperation.
Hmm. Yes, yes,
And if you want to waste it, get into conflict.
yes. Anyway, well, I think we are coming up on the 2-hour mark. So I was wondering if you had any things that you wanted to say that you felt that you weren't able to say in our discussion.
Well, no, I'd like to. Well, first of all, I'm on the tail end of a book that I'm writing about
Yes,
the problems of religion,
yes,
and I think that as the current situation and conflicts are occurring,
Mhm.
and my own concepts of the harm that religion does, it's really becoming more intensified and making me think even more deeply into it.
Mhm.
Uh, I see religion coming up. I just saw something about religion having some kind of a factor in the Ukraine dispute,
Mm.
and I'm struggling with that. But people are trying to drag that in, and we need, as Lenin's anthem said, a world with no religion, a world
Mm.
where reason and logic and human
And that's
interrelations
that's John
dominate.
Lennon, not Vladimir Lenin.
Oh yeah, I meant John. Yes, although I must say,
Although I don't think Lenin,
I'm sure that Vladimir Lenin would agree.
I think Lenin would be not be a supporter of religion either, but although,
Oh, for
but so
sure
can
he
you
wasn't.
just, so maybe just on the last couple minutes, just explain what your book on religion is about?
Oh, it's well, first of all, most of the books on religion by other writers like Christopher Hitchens et al. Are about the philosophical absurdity of religion and how it doesn't hold up if you think about it at all. But my book is about the social effects of it, what
Mm,
religion has done, and
mm,
what it has done historically, what it is currently doing, and how we should get rid of it.
yeah,
So in doing that, I talk about religion as a social phenomenon, and then I analyze the role of the three Abrahamic religions,
mm,
what they are, what their origins are, what their beliefs are, and what roles they're playing today,
mm,
and doing and how we should get rid of them. And
mm,
it's interesting because two of them two of them are universal in that they want everybody
mm,
to be this, and one of them is exclusive and wants to separate itself from everyone else.
mm.
And those are things that are interesting to look at, and actually they're and how they are weakening. And while one of the universal ones is actually growing in its power, the weaker one, Christianity, is diminishing.
Mm. Yes, interesting. So anyway, we've come to our 2 hour mark, Albert. So I think that was very interesting. I think we did get into a few points of contention, uh, especially in the when I was asking you questions. But I think there was a lot of interesting sort of discussion around labor theory of value and communism and so on. Some indigenous issues, but I think we talked about many things which I'm hoping that our listeners will find will interest them. So, without further ado, I would like to thank you very much for appearing on this episode of Rational Space Disputations.
Okay, thank you, and I'll leave you with the final statement of or suggestion. Workers of the world unite.
All right. Thanks very much.